that you continue to keep well. This week we have had the summer solstice, the longest day, and in a couple of days it will be Midsummer's Night. So I guess that means that summer is well and truly here. And just as summer has arrived, it seems that the messages on lockdown and the current pandemic are getting a little bit brighter. And I hope that some of you have managed to have socially distanced reunions with your friends and family. It's difficult, isn't it, not to reach out and offer them a hug. But perhaps, even though that's difficult, being able to spend time together is a welcome blessing right now. It's still only a few weeks since we celebrated the Feast of Pentecost, and here in Bedfordshire, as part of Bible Month, we have been studying the book that is associated in the Jewish celebration of Pentecost with that time of the year, the book of Ruth. A book which brings together many themes, and it's been interesting to explore it and to consider some of the themes that are there, but themes that perhaps are all knitted together with the different expressions of love shown by the different characters in the story. So today, with the sort of shadow of Pentecost in mind and with the book of Ruth in front of us, I thought I would try and bring that all together with the hymn Love Divine, All Loves Excelling. Now, many of you may be familiar with the Bible's great chapter on love, 1 Corinthians chapter 13. It's a favourite at weddings, and because it's often sung when couples get married, it's not unusual for it to be chosen for funerals as well. And of course there, perhaps we hear it with a different emphasis. Maybe you don't realise though that the chapter 1 Corinthians 13 comes from a section of Paul's first letter to the Corinthians in which he is dealing with the work of God's Spirit and in particular with the gifts of the Spirit. And chapter 13 is right at the heart. It's the middle of 3 chapters that deal with that subject. Paul is worried that the Corinthians, as they often did, have got carried away with the excitement of the gifts of the Spirit. God has been at work amongst them in some pretty remarkable ways, and they, as they often did, and as we often do as humans, seem to have turned it into a competition, each one trying to outdo their neighbour with the ways in which God is at work, and sort of treating the gifts as some kind of trinkets to be compared and measured. And Paul has to remind them that worship is not a competition to see who can display their gifts loudest or who can do most, but in actual fact that the reason that God pours out the gifts of the Spirit is so that the whole life of the church can be built up. He says to them in 1 Corinthians 12 that the gifts of the Spirit are given to each one of you for the common good. And as he goes on in his exploration of the different ways that God by the Spirit is at work amongst the Corinthians and amongst Christians everywhere, he declares right at the heart of that section, he says, now I will show you the most excellent way. God shows the power of the Spirit in all sorts of ways, but Paul says here's the most excellent way of all. And he goes on with that extended meditation on love that some of us are so familiar with and find so comforting. The first 3 verses of the chapter, Paul seems to be saying, and I'm going to summarise, you may get involved in the most spectacular things for God. Through you, God may be shown in the most unimaginable ways. He says you might sing like an angel, you might speak like a prophet, or you may even die like a martyr. But he says, if you do not have love, then it all amounts to nothing. That is quite a stunning thing for Paul to say, isn't it? That whatever is happening, whatever is going on, no matter how involved we are and no matter how successful we seem to be being, if it isn't grounded in love, then it isn't worth anything. And having said that, he goes on to say the familiar words. Love is patient. Love is kind. It doesn't envy. It doesn't boast. It isn't proud. It doesn't dishonour others. It isn't self-seeking. It isn't easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love doesn't delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails. Where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part and we prophesy in part. But when completeness comes, what is in part disappears. When I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put the ways of childhood behind me. For now we see only a reflection as in a mirror, but then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part. Then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. And now these three remain: faith, hope and love. But the greatest of these is love. So what Paul is describing is the many faces of love. And to be able to love in this way is the greatest of all of the spiritual gifts. This kind of love, and indeed I would say all human love, flows from the heart of God. Elsewhere in the Bible we read from John, who writes, God is love, and whoever lives in love lives in God, and God in them. To live in love then is to live in God, and to receive from God the greatest spiritual gift of them all, the gift of love. God's love excels our human love because God's love is perfect in every one of the dimensions that Paul mentions. There is no greater patience than God's patience. There is no greater kindness than God's kindness, and so on. God's love excels even our love. Now in some hymn books the hymn has 4 verses, Love Divine, All Love's Excelling, and the version we're about to hear and sing does include the 4th verse, the verse that we often don't see in our Methodist hymn books. It's not actually the 4th verse, it's the 2nd of the 4 verses, and in it we invite God to breathe the spirit of love into our troubled hearts so that we can be freed from the selfishness that is sin, and then find instead the glorious rest that comes with knowing that we are completely and utterly loved. Because to know that God's love for us has no beginning or end and is without measure is the beginning of what it means to be at liberty. It sets us free to learn from God how we might love others, which in itself sets us free to do our part in building God's kingdom of love here on earth as it is in heaven. And so as we linger on the thought of God's amazing love for us, let us ponder that thought as we worship the God whose divine love excels every other gift and is poured out on each of us today. You are loved because God says so. Amen.